Three different theories walk out into the public sphere. One gets accepted by the scientific community and fundamentally changes our understanding of something in science. One becomes a fringe idea that has no real bearing on reality, but it's fun to think about. And the last one gets featured as a Fox News headline. Theory is one of those words that show up in a number of places and has different connotations for each one, which can make it incredibly hard to communicate fundamental ideas in science with the general public. And to me, this problem is most prevalent when talking about today's subject, the theory of evolution. Let's just get the inflammatory statements out of the way in the beginning. You probably don't understand the theory of evolution. Now, to prove my point, I asked my friends and family to tell me what evolution is without looking it up. And to my surprise, they gave me really good definitions. Well, all except for one. And I had some answers that went in a direction that I didn't expect them to. My fault for not being specific with the task, but they had good answers nonetheless. The theory concerns itself with one thing and one thing only: how species change over generations and the mechanisms and conditions that affect those changes. It's not like Pokemon where your little salamander turns into a fire-breathing dragon once they've leveled up enough. Where it doesn't concern itself is with the origins of life. Now, while we're not going to be focused on how life came about for this video, it's always best to start in the beginning. Abiogenesis is a fairly large word, but it's simple to break down. A, meaning without or non, bio, biological, and genesis, formation or origin. To explain it in the easiest way possible, it's the natural chemical processes through which organic compounds form and how they come together to form larger organic structures such as RNA and DNA. As most biology courses will tell you, DNA naturally replicates in the presence of certain enzymes, which are naturally occurring basic organic compounds that arise through similar processes. Of course, all of this does require specific conditions to occur. Like any other chemical process, oxygen and hydrogen won't come together to form water unless there's energy added into the system, like electricity or an open flame. So there's no magic going on behind the curtains here, it's just chemistry. Once these organic compounds form into complex enough structures that they are self-sustaining and replicating, that's where the jump from chemical process to life occurs. Abiogenesis is the current leading idea of how life originated on Earth, but it's not the only idea. The only other one that has been suggested that carries any kind of scientific thought to it is an ancient one that comes from around the time of Greek philosophers and thinkers: panspermia. If you thought I was going to talk about religion, you need to look at the syllabus again. In this classroom, we are currently talking about science. You can reconcile your faith with that after we're done. Panspermia is another really simple idea to understand. Please take a look at this image here, and you should have a firm understanding. It's the idea that life didn't originate on this planet and instead was seeded here by a number of things like comet impacts or the little green men. Only one of those is seriously considered. The problem with panspermia is that it's not actually an explanation to the origins of life and just kind of kicks that question down the road to be answered at a later time. Abiogenesis still has to come into play somewhere in the process, even if it's not here on Earth. With that out of the way, we can get into talking about the theory of evolution. As can be seen from the definitions I got from my friends and family, evolution is a word that simply means change over a period of time. It's gradual developments that don't happen all at once. Imagine something like your taste in music. You probably don't listen to the same things that you did as a kid. The genres you listen to have gradually changed over the years. Even if you were in the same genre as you were when you were younger, the actual music is drastically different than what it was 5, 10, 20 years ago. AC/DC, Metallica, and Motionless in White are all vastly different from each other, but they are evolutionary steps in the rock genre. When we talk about evolution in the context of science, while not explicitly, we're most certainly talking about the theory of evolution. We should probably take some time to break that word down here so that we're all on the same page. As stated in the intro to this video, theory has a lot of places where it can be correctly used. The common usage is in one of two ways: a set of principles of which some kind of activity is based, or an idea to justify a course of action / account for a situation. Music theory would be a prime example for the former, and a conspiracy theory would be the latter. In both of these cases, a theory beards? Look, I never said I was the best at talking. In both of these cases, a theory builds off of presupposed ideas or practices to create cognitive flow from one thing to another. A scientific theory functions in a similar manner to the first example, but the principles that build one are laws of science, which are fundamental truths of the world, and as close as science gets to claiming something as a fact. If that didn't make sense to you, then allow me to explain it like this. The principles of music theory are not set in stone and can change over time. This would mean that the overall music theory of today is different from the music theory of the past at a fundamental or most basic level. The principles of a scientific theory don't change, only the final interpretation because of new principles being added. Honestly, this is a particular rabbit hole for another day, but hopefully this brief foray into it puts us on the same page of understanding as to what a theory in science is. Now, we all know where the theory of evolution got its start, right? In 1859, On the Origin of Species was published by Charles Darwin and has a lot of basis in his findings during his travels on the HMS Beagle. If you ever get a chance to sit down and read it, I highly recommend that you skip it, honestly. While Darwin's work was pivotal in changing how we understand the changes in species, it's a book that was very clearly written in the 1850s and 60s. It's wordy and really dry to read, so unless you're looking for a historical perspective on evolution, it's probably not going to give you the insights into the topic that you'd need. This is actually a common problem in the philosophical and scientific literature prior to the early 1900s, as it was largely meant for an audience that was often more educated and sophisticated than your average person. It's a good thing that writing has evolved past that point. None of that is to say that you should ignore what's written in the book. One of the major achievements in it is laying out the prediction for the discovery of a transitional fossil between dinosaurs and birds. And 2 years after its publications, Archaeopteryx was discovered. But the major focus of the book is natural selection. When you hear something described as Darwinian, your mind will almost certainly go to ideas like survival of the fittest. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that that's what natural selection is. It's not, but that's what the cultural zeitgeist for Darwin's major contribution to science is. It's not the strongest or the smartest that survive, but those that are best adapted to their environment, or those that can make the environment work for them the best, that continue on. A tiger might be the apex predator in Asia, but you drop one into the desert and you're going to have a dead tiger and a number of animal rights violations. As new adaptations appear within a species, the natural pressures of the environment will favor the ones that help the species propagate and disfavor the ones that are detrimental to survival in the area. This is the basic principle behind natural selection. Eyes are useful for hunting or finding food in the day or even low light environments, but in a cave you're rarely going to need eyes because there is no light to utilize them with. This should be practically intuitive to you. But for the sharp-minded among you, there is a question that should be glaringly obvious here. How exactly did those adaptations come about? Darwin's original proposition for evolution relies heavily on an easily observed fact that there are a number of variations within members of a particular species. These traits come about in a number of ways, from being born with them to having them appear as they live their lives. Let's take a flamingo as an example. What color is a flamingo? If you answered pink, you're half right. A flamingo's natural color is white. As they live their lives, the food that they eat turns the pigmentation in their feathers pink over time. But when they are separated from that particular food source, they revert from being pink back to white. This is the difference between an inherited trait and an acquired trait. For a long time, it was believed that an animal's inherited and acquired traits could be passed down through its offspring. Obviously, that's not the case. A dog that loses one of its legs in life doesn't produce three-legged dogs. At the time of Darwin, this was largely understood to be the case. It was the inherited traits alone that got passed down. And at the time, it was largely believed that it was a blending of traits of both the parents that got passed down, which is now understood to be obsolete and outdated. So, what is the modern understanding? Well, if you're able to remember back to your biology class, you should remember something about the topic. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. No, not that. In 1865, Gregor Mendel proposed several principles that govern inheritance through the generations. These principles were based off of several years of work with pea plants in an attempt to better understand how traits were transferred between generations. His work primarily focused on dominant and recessive traits, which he hypothesized was contributed by both parents with a substance called elementin. Honestly, that sounds a lot cooler than DNA, which had its first real discovery in 1869 with nucleic acid. What he ended up proving out wasn't anything new. In fact, it was largely known about by biologists at the time. But it was largely believed to only affect a limited number of traits, so his work was flat out rejected at the time it was proposed and would be lost to the sands of time until the early 1900s. In fact, it seems a lot of the early work of what would eventually become known as genetics fell into this same boat. Like, even though nucleic acid was discovered in 1869, it wouldn't be until DNA structure was discovered in 1953 that the importance of the earlier discovery was actually appreciated. To me, it's a little odd that genetics had to go through a period of rediscovery like it did, especially when you consider that two of its categories, epigenetics and phylogenetics, make up the bulk of our modern understanding for the theory of evolution. But then again, it's not unusual for us humans to ignore things that are correct for the things that we wish were true. So I probably shouldn't be that surprised. I mean, flat earthers still exist, even though that was disproven before the founding of Rome. Now, clearly, Mendelian inheritance explains how traits get passed down, but it doesn't really explain where these changes come from in the first place. For that, we need to look at two things: epigenetics, which I mentioned earlier, and mutations. And we're going to start with that second one. Mutations are changes within the DNA sequence of an organism. I'm just going to nip this in the bud right away. It's not X-Men. There isn't a mutation that's going to randomly give someone superpowers. Genetic mutations are incredibly common, to the point that the likelihood of you not having any kind of mutation is statistically impossible. For the sake of simplicity within this video, we aren't going to really go into depth about how mutations occur. It's usually either a variation within the biochemical process that forms the DNA or an encoding error in the replication process. Typically, they are prevented through a number of mechanisms within the process, but because preventing mutations tends to be more work than it's worth, there is no investment into completely preventing them. Most mutations have no real impact. They either don't do anything because of where the mutation occurs in the DNA sequence, or the mutation ends up functioning in practically the same way as the original sequence. Where we start to see any kind of impact is from a large collection of them in specific areas. There are occasions where one single mutation can have a large impact, but those are highly uncommon. Genetic mutations usually deal with the chemical and protein synthesis within the body. This is things like vitamin production. As you can imagine, your body producing too little or too much of a vitamin might be bad, and there are circumstances where it's good. As an example, most animals on the planet are able to synthesize vitamin C, but humans and a number of our closest relatives, as well as guinea pigs, some bats, and birds, can't. All of these creatures have diets high in vitamin C, so there was no pressure to correct the loss of the production within the body, and it may have actually been detrimental to do so, as vitamin C poisoning is a thing. But this all isn't what you normally think of when it comes to mutations and evolution. Epigenetics are the factors that control gene expression. That is an oversimplification, to say the least. I spent like an hour trying to come up with the easiest way to explain it, and honestly, I don't think that does it justice. Unlike mutations, epigenetics doesn't change the underlying sequence of the DNA. Imagine them like switches. When they're turned on, they activate the chemical and protein synthesis within DNA, and when they're turned off, they deactivate it. And this is the major driving force in the evolution and the sources of those evolutionary adaptations. Why? Well, I'm glad you asked. When we're looking at the differences between species, we're usually looking at macro or large-scale changes. The differences between wings and arms, feathers, scales, and hair, or even the changes between leaf patterns in trees. But why did those things form that way? What is the underlying cause for developing a wing over an arm or hair over scales? It's the chemicals and proteins that are produced by your genetic sequence that control that. They act like the signal from the gene to produce certain structures. When and how long those signals are turned on determines the shape and function of these structures being produced. So if, for example, the gene that controls your nail growth were sent into overdrive, well, congratulations there, Sabretooth. Oh yeah, that's right. Didn't quite explain that. Uh, Epigenetic factors don't only occur during fetal development. They can occur at any point within your life. Now, the odds of them doing something as crazy as, what we see in X-Men with Sabretooth growing out his fingernails or Wolverine making the bone claws, that's not likely. Everything from your environment, diet, general lifestyle, and even the everyday tasks that you perform affect your epigenetic factors. And while not all of them, a good number of them are inheritable. So if you and a number of other people grow up and live your entire lives in an area where it's beneficial to be extra flexible, then the likelihood of that becoming an epigenetic factor that gets passed down to your offspring becomes significantly higher. Or like needing to have a shorter focal range in your eyes because you don't need to focus on far off objects. I don't know about you, but that probably has something to do with more and more people needing glasses as the ages go on. Selection pressure affects which epigenetic factors are prominently passed along within a population due to environmental factors, and if that trait is dominant or recessive. This affects how protein sequences are translated during the developmental process of the species, and mutations within that sequence may or may not cause another change within that process, depending on if it's beneficial, neutral, or detrimental. All of this combines to become the adapted traits we see among species, and is our current understanding of how the evolutionary process works. But that alone isn't the whole theory of evolution. Now, earlier I mentioned there being two categories of genetics that makes up our understanding of the theory of evolution. If epigenetics is the underlying core process, then phylogenetics is tracing that process through the generations. Have you ever seen those images of the tree of life, or perhaps something more like ape to man? That's phylogenetics, or at least a simplified way to look at it. If we were wanting to make a history of the human race, we'd naturally start with the civilizations that currently exist and work backwards to find out where they came from until we ended up with an unbroken chain from the first humans to the world we have now. Naturally, along the way, we'd end up finding civilizations that collapsed, and there would be hundreds of them that get lost in the flow of time, never to be seen again. But there are still traces within our history of things that have no explanation other than lost civilizations that contributed these out of place things. That is what phylogenetics tries to do. But instead of finding ruins or weird bits of language, they're looking at the genomes and epigenetic factors of species and how they've changed over time. Phylogenetics is how we understand the changes and transitions between species, like how wolves became dogs. Actually, I don't think that history analog is quite done yet. Because there's a question that often gets asked when you're talking about evolution, specifically when it comes to humans. I'm sure you've heard or perhaps made the argument, if we all came from monkeys, then why are there still monkeys? Well, if Americans came from Africa, Europe, and Asia, then why are there still Africans, Europeans, and Asians? That question really sounds absurd, especially given that we know the general history of how people came to America. And much like how it wasn't the whole population of those continents that came to the Americas, it isn't the whole population of a species that undergoes these evolutionary changes. In Darwin's works, he noted that the species of the Galapagos Islands were the same types of species that were present on the mainlands of the Americas. In both places, you had tortoises, iguanas, and finches. And if they're the same type of animals, that means that there's a genetic link between them. One of the overarching principles of phylogenetics is that you can't outgrow your phylogeny. To put it in other words, you're not going to have a species that just shows up that isn't related to anything else. It's always going to link back down the phylogenetic line. A human will always be a human, but they're also everything that exists within their phylogenetic lineage prior. And while our future descendants may end up being a new species, they will always be humans. And this is also why the term fish is a nightmare term that needs to be eradicated. That's right. If you thought I was going to get through an entire video about evolution and not continue my crusade on the word fish, then you were poorly mistaken. For every vertebrate is a fish all the way down. The word either means absolutely nothing or it applies to nearly everything. You're a fish. I'm a fish. We're all fish. Sorry about that. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this trek into what the theory of evolution is. If you learned something new, please tell me about it in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and keep up with my videos as they come out. And as always, I'll see you next time.